This is the Kratom Science Journal Club with Dr. Jonathan Cachat, neuroscientist and expert in psychopharmacology. In each episode, we discuss an article in a peer-reviewed journal. I'm your host, Brian Gallagher, blog and social media writer for KratomScience.com, your source for all things Kratom. This is the lack of contribution of 7-hydroxymitragynine to the anti-nociceptive effects of mitragynine in mice, a pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamic study. This is University of Florida, a team, and there's now 3 past Kratom Science guests on this study. Abhishek Sharma, Dr. Lance McMahon, and Dr. Christopher McCurdy, who I finally got to interview, and I put him on the first podcast of the year, so when we put this out, that'll be 3 episodes ago, I think. And Dr. McMahon, he's the pharmacodynamics guy, and Abhishek Sharma is the pharmacokinetic guy. And it was actually led by Aaron Berthold and Shyam Campbell. I actually contacted both of them to be on the podcast, but I didn't hear back. But I actually got to talk to Dr. McCurdy about this study a little bit. Basically, a study in mice. I think what they're trying to find out is, so we all know that mitragynine metabolizes into 7-hydroxymitragynine. I guess what they did was they took isolated 7-hydroxymitragynine and they took isolated mitragynine and compared the effects, and they want to basically see if mitragynine gets its pain-relieving effects from that metabolism into 7-hydroxy. So 7-hydroxy is considered the one, like if people were taking that isolated, it would probably be as heavy as, taking morphine. Although I'm unclear as to whether that's a partial agonist or a full agonist. But what Dr. McCurdy told me about 7-hydroxy is it comes with all the baggage of heroin, and he even said fentanyl if you would isolate that. So they're trying to determine, because there was a study earlier, we can get into all this, but they're trying to determine if it's the 7-hydroxy that requires the pain-relieving effects. And so
I think I would say too that their main comparison was how much of the 7-hydroxymitragynine is metabolized from mitragynine. If you just take mitragynine, we know that some of it gets metabolized into the 7-hydroxy. How much is that concentration of the 7-hydroxy, and can that concentration of the 7-hydroxy account for the pain-killing effect? So I think that's the main sort of take home from here, and ultimately, there's not enough 7-hydroxymitragynine, or the pain relief is not on the same time profile as just injecting 7-hydroxymitragynine. I think that's where they're saying the lack of contribution.
They've told me, both Dr. Sharma and McCurdy, we were thinking before that there might be 7-hydroxy in the fresh leaf, but they have told me that they have not found anywhere. There was like a German team years ago studying it, and they've found barely any 7-hydroxy in the leaves, in the fresh leaf. Once it becomes dried, then there's like a small amount of that, and then with some of the extracts, there's been some evidence in the past that there are people that are artificially upping the 7-HMG in the extracts. So when we talk about, I guess, natural is more safe, some people criticize that and say just because it's plant doesn't mean it can't kill you or whatever. But I think in this case, you're getting less of the alkaloid 7-hydroxy considered controversial when you're doing a fresh leaf product. But so this shows that there are actually anti-nociceptive effects with just the mitragynine and how it metabolizes. The right
yeah,
take,
and just
or...
the 7-hydroxy as well. Just the 7-hydroxy also showed the pain relieving effects. It's primarily the 7-hydroxy mitragynine that's metabolized from mitragynine is not critical to the pain killing effects. Yeah, and I mean, I think what you mentioned too in the controversy, and you did well on the blog post about this paper as well. So there's a blog post over at kratomscience.com, and it sort of leaves people with, take homes for the Kratom consumer. But I mean, ultimately, for people who are trying to prohibit or ban or make Kratom illegal, they had to have something that they could hold on to that said, like, this is just as bad as morphine, or this is just as risky as fentanyl. And I think the 7-hydroxy mitragynine is the one that sort of, there was early indications that was the one that if it was more potent, that it could potentially be the one that could lead to an overdose. I don't think there's any evidence of that, but like, that's what the prohibition is grabbed onto. And so it's interesting to hear, that this group hasn't really necessarily found it in naturally occurring fresh leaf. And then we see about, I think 1% to 2% of it in dried leaf, but with the extracts, it could be artificially increased. But ultimately, I think that maybe the community bought into this notion that 7-hydroxy is the one that we need to look out for, and didn't really pursue any additional research on, like, where does this come from when it is metabolized in the body, how much of the benefits of Kratom consumption are relative to that, except for a study like this. Like, I mean, this is a pretty significant study that must have taken place over at least a year, but maybe longer. And that there were hundreds of mice that they used, and they did the sex differences comparison. But ultimately, like, this is, it seems like, if I could summarize in the layman's terms, it's like, okay, everybody just hold on about 7-hydroxy and being, dangerous, and we need to be really worried about it. There's not really evidence to suggest that this is even behind the beneficial effects, or that it's found in naturally occurring quantities that would propose any risk or danger. And so I'm glad McCurdy's group is investigated this, because if it was the opposite and it was even more dangerous than we thought, we'd want those results out. But also, if it's not as dangerous or not as implicated as we may have initially thought, we'd also want those results out.
Yeah, and I kind of touched on in that blog post about, there was a sheriff in Mississippi, and I just messaged with a lady who's an activist down in Mississippi, and this is still going on with this task force that's trying to ban it all over the state. But his claim was in 2019 that Kratom is 13 times more powerful than morphine, so kids have access to morphine simply by buying this in a convenience store, which is all kinds of wrong. But what he's doing is taking a claim about 7-hydroxy mitragynine alone that was from a scientific paper, and he's saying this is what Kratom does. And I said, well, on the other side, we have things like in these mouse studies where they say mitragynine has low abuse potential. So the other side will say, look, you can't get addicted to Kratom because this study said it has a low abuse potential, which I think is also an incorrect statement. But what we've always talked about, and you call it the Entourage Effect, Dr. McCurdy calls it like a symphony orchestra. The alkaloids acting together aren't the same as alkaloids acting alone. We've repeated that over and over again on here, but I guess it's worth repeating if somebody's just going to listen to one podcast. But McCurdy said if you put the 7-HMG on full blast, that's going to, have the high opioid stuff, but mitragynine on full blast is not like that. And there was another study that this actually refuted by Krugel in 2019, Krugel et al. And a 2019 study concluded 7-hydroxymitragynine is an active metabolite of mitragynine, and a key mediator of its analgesic effects. I posted an interview with Sharma, and he said that is a drawback because they're not looking at the full metabolism. So this actually refuted that to say that, the mitragynine has analgesic effects on its own.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, then, yeah. So they had, like blank mouse plasma and blood here, and we're, giving known concentrations and putting that into the standalone plasma. But then they also were looking at like lung tissue, liver tissue, brain tissue, of all of these mice that were dosed at different rates, and measuring both the mitragynine and the 7-hydroxymitragynine. And so, it took me a while. This paper was a bit of an alphabet soup, but it took me a while to understand, like, to distinguish between, because the 7-hydroxymitragynine in and of itself alone has analgesic effects. And you can find a dose of 7-hydroxymitragynine that is roughly equivalent to the mitragynine. It's about half of what the mitragynine is, roughly, or like a third. So it's not to say that in and of itself it doesn't have analgesic effects. It's just maybe not a key mediator, and the metabolite, the metabolism of the mitragynine to 7-hydroxymitragynine is not the key active metabolite of how mitragynine produces its effects. It's not necessary.
And so in terms of drug development, which I think, eventually they want to do down there, we also talked about it on that couple episodes ago with Dr. McCurdy. Is this looking good for mitragynine as maybe a lower risk opioid? And is that what you think, like, the ultimate thing they're pushing towards is trying to measure the safety profile of like a pure mitragynine, maybe pain relieving drug?
Yeah. I mean, so if they were going to be turning mitragynine into a pharmaceutical that would be used to treat like opiate use disorder or opiate withdrawal, I think that before this big study, there could have been concerns or voiced, it's kind of like the sheriff of Mississippi, but they could have said, well, the mitragynine is not active by itself. It's turning into this 7-hydroxymitragynine, and that's way more dangerous, and it's not really helping people off opiates. It's just giving them another opiate that's just as powerful, if not more powerful than morphine. But this is saying that, and it sounds like if you were to develop it into a pill, that you could make a mitragynine pharmaceutical that was just mitragynine by itself, and you wouldn't have to worry about the 7-hydroxy being metabolized in the high concentrations.
It says here we investigated the hot plate antinicession, pharmacokinetics, tissue distribution, mice to determine the extent to which 7-hydroxy metabolized from mitragynine counts for the antinociceptive. So
and then the sex differences as well. So they have that, like male female comparison, which is, it's always interesting in, I think, pain research in particular. There are hormonal, genetic, chemical differences, like receptor density differences between males and females. And generally what you find is like, either, I guess there are only two options. Sex either does have an effect and changes the result, or it doesn't. But I felt like it was sort of like weird places where it didn't have a result in this paper, and then some other ones where it did have a result, or like a behavioral manifestation.
Because we know that, the alcohol, in terms of alcohol tolerance and everything, is this like a regular thing that they would study male and female in sort of maybe like drug development?
Yeah. I mean, so it has to be considered. We just know that it is. I mean, so one of the differences here was like the concentration of the 7-hydroxy or just the mitragynine in the brain tissue was, I think, 2 times higher in males than it was in females. But that was producing the same behavioral outcome. So like increasing the amount of time that the mice could keep their tails on the hot plate. So it was equivalent behavioral effects, but a 2x difference in the concentration. And so, just from a concentration perspective, like dosing properly, there are all sorts of factors that like we consider humans to be the same, but sex comes up as a major difference. And I don't remember what study it was actually, the wise tale about this, but like essentially there are some drugs that don't work in men but only work in women. And like in the drug development pipeline, scientists get to the point where they're like super baffled that, well, this is the 30th time we've run these experiments in the mice. Why would it just all of a sudden not work now? And then it goes down to, can come down to sex. And then you also have to keep track of like the menstrual cycles, because the hormonal changes there. Like I'm sure any woman could tell us that there is a difference across the course of the, those 30 days in terms of how they feel and how they're thinking. But the one thing I want to mention in closing on the sex differences with the mice is they also were talking about like drug metabolism studies in beagles. And someone was looking at how mitragynine was metabolized, or like how long it was over what time course. Generally, they look over like 4 hours. And in the beagles, it was like the exact opposite of what they saw in the mice in terms of an increased concentration in the male brain versus the female brain. In the beagles, I think that the females ended up having more or something like that. It wasn't jumped into deeper, but there are not only sex differences within species, but there's also differences across species. And it might not be what you would initially or logically assume or hypothesize.
Yeah, here I found it. In female beagle dogs, the AUC ratio, what is that? AUC. In female beagle dogs, the AUC ratio of 7-hydroxymitragynine to mitragynine was 13%, 1.4-fold greater than found in female mice, indicating that concentrations of free 7-HMG might be greater in dogs and have more potential to influence the overall pharmacology of MTG. So, would that extrapolate maybe to humans? Maybe, since there's a difference between mice and dogs, would there be a difference between...
There certainly could be.
Yeah.
Right? You can't rule it out. And I mean, I think for the longest time, scientific research has been sort of plagued by, masculine perspective. And really, like, when you start learning about experimental design and stuff in undergrad, what the teachers say sort of jokingly is like, well, we know a lot about undergrads because they're the test subjects of all these psychological experiments that are being ran on college campuses. But doesn't necessarily mean that it converts to the entire population. So, I would say really just within the last 50 years, the careful monitoring and paying attention to these sex differences has changed how drug development occurs and moves forward, certainly.
Yeah, and that's another reason not to go on the internet and take advice from some random dude about how much you should take, and people should be saying, this is how much I take.
That would have to be a study, and it's like essentially they're still having the same behavioral level of effects. So like the percent of time that the latency increase on the hot plate was the same, even though it was a difference in concentration. And so maybe that goes to speak to something about the receptor density. And I think we know that there's like a genetic change in redheads that also leads to them like generally leading more opiates than the general population, and that's the way it has to do, the way that it's metabolized, I think. Yeah, so I think I guess it's known, or maybe it started as a joke or just supplanted the joke, but like redheads can take more pain than normal folk, but that means they need more opiates in order to achieve the same amount of pain relieving activity.
That's why my wife can hang with opiates, I guess.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Perhaps.
No, I mean, she's only taken the one prescribed, so we haven't really experimented with it. Yeah, she's a total ginger.
So depending on the study that they were performing, they either housed the mice in 5 per cage or 4 per cage, and they were trying to make sure that the administration of the mitragynine did not have some non-specific like behavioral effects or inhibition on behavior. Like taking more of it just causes an overall increase in alertness or awareness, like you're getting lazy or you're tired or you're more tired. And so they were looking at overall locomotor activity, and it just caught my eye how high those counts were. So like They were using, so they're talking about just like activity and movement and 200 some odd events over the time period that they were looking at. And I think that when we were studying the zebrafish, like if you look at the total distance traveled versus the number of times that like behavior was initiated or started, I think that ultimately like is two different measures of behavioral inhibition or activation. And so it's not a big point, but I scrolled past one of the notes that I made about how they were counting those activity movements and the overall locomotor activity, and it wasn't entirely clear to me. I'm curious, did he mention, did you guys talk about that at all? Like, did they have video cameras in the home cages, or were there light beam breaks? Do you know any
No, we didn't get that far into it, but I wonder, like, the whole rat park experiment. I wonder, like, why don't scientists like put them in a rat park ever, and then test like happy normal rats for drug effects? Is it because maybe it's only a comparison anyway, so if they're all in the similar environment, come out.
So what you're talking about, rat park, you're like an enriched, environmentally enriched, socially rich environment. And I think that the studies you're referring to are essentially that like animals going through drug withdrawal or drug self-administration administer less drugs if they're in a enriched, socially supported environment. And so I think why don't we all just give them all enrichment and do that? Well, so yeah, you would have to do it for all of the mice in the study, right? Mm-hmm. And they all have to be held at the same conditions. And I mean, they even go into moving the mice out of the vivarium at this school into the experimental room, and it was on a similar light cycle. The temperature and humidity were relatively equivalent. So it would cost more, and it already costs dollars a day to maintain just one mouse. But ultimately, the cages that they're storing these in just in a normal study are not like, they're not being deprived of anything. Like there are particular experiments where you set up like, there's no bedding, there's no like, sometimes you put a little like toilet paper roll in there to have a little tunnel that they can crawl in, or they're putting dividers in between the mice to purposely isolate them and separate them. So, ultimately, I think it would be fair to say, as long as they're all being treated the same, that these mice are just sort of in the normal, quote unquote, whatever normal mouse living housing activity is. They're not being deprived, nor are they being specifically enriched. And in a study like this, when we're looking at hundreds of mice over the course of that time, like introducing another variable like environmental enrichment would just complicate the analysis so much more beyond like the analytical chemistry that they're doing and through the behavior and sex differences.
Yeah. I guess if they were free to like be in different parts of the thing, then it would completely change. Throw too many variables in it. I think you explained it, but what I was talking about, there's if anybody's more curious, you look up rat park, and the idea was that there was a rat park experiment where they created, instead of in cages, they created like an environment where rats could be happy and have social contact, and they were less likely to use, I think, cocaine or morphine, because, and the conclusion was, when people are more social, they live in a better environment rather than having all the stresses of maybe like modern life or poverty or even being in prison. You're less likely to abuse drugs because you have more options for happiness, essentially. But yeah, I understand why they wouldn't do that. That was just a general question.
So I mean, they weren't enriched, they weren't deprived, they just sort of headed the middle and held the same. And like I said, one of the biggest costs is just keeping those mice alive in the vivarium. It's several dollars per mouse per day. It was one of the reasons why we spent so much time developing the zebrafish model, is because it costs way different. It was much less to keep them alive. Yeah.
And that's why everybody should write NIDA and tell them to give Everybody give people studying the drugs more money.
Yeah, exactly.
Really. Do you ever want to talk about your lab on the show or that you're working on?
The cannabis lab?
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's going well. We're moving along now to setting up the instrumentation, right? So we have the ICP-MS for heavy metals. We have the SciEx LCMS for pesticides, and then the HPLCs for potency. And so, we just have finished off essentially what was a giant construction effort over the last couple months, if not, half a year. And so now we're moving on to like more of the specific outfitting of the cannabis lab with instrumentation and equipment for actually doing the laboratory work. So we're moving along.
So this is in Columbus?
Mm-hmm. Columbus, Ohio,
yeah. Yeah. And so you'll just be like studying cannabis? Is that basically
it's a licensed third-party testing lab, and so one of the one of the main differences between the black market and a regulated market is that the products have to be safe for consumption, and so we test for heavy metals, we test for pesticides, we test for molds and mildew and fungus, we examine samples for like any foreign matter, like indications of a bug infestation or like hair or other, just stuff from the physical environment. And so, essentially we're testing to make sure that it's safe. There's nothing in the products that could harm, especially an immunocompromised individual. But then also like you want to know the potency and for the longest time in just a black market, cannabis situation, like you don't know that it's 15 or 23 or 25 or 30% THC. So, every patient has the right to being informed about what they're consuming, and then also that to know that it's safe. And so that's what we're open. It'll be my second lab in Ohio that's doing cannabis safety testing for the medical program here.
That's awesome. Because we're talking about this guy Soren Shade. I've had him on a couple times, but his company did like a full alkaloid profile on some kratom that they grew. And I think he's working with the lab, and they're doing like a research project with the university. So I don't know if he had funding for that, but it would be great if everybody who bought kratom, like I buy my medical marijuana, and it goes through a lab like you're setting up there, and I get all my cannabinoids list, and it would be great if people started to be able to get their full alkaloid list on kratom.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, it's one of the biggest parts of this study and the supplemental figures was all of the validation that they had to do. So they were examining different biological tissue, whether it was like brain or lung, for example, and then they wanted to ensure that when they were measuring for mitragynine or the 7-hydroxymitragynine, that it was valid. Like they weren't measuring something else or like parts of something else. And so they're in the cannabis space, despite the medical cannabis being around for some time, like the laboratory methods are not even standardized from lab to lab in cannabis. And a lot of that has to do with different matrices and the lack of validation. So like you can imagine that both a hard candy and a brownie are both edibles, but they're like fundamentally made up of different things. And that's what the matrix is. So it's the difference between lung tissue versus brain tissue would be a hard candy versus a brownie. And so, there are, I think, a few kratom product manufacturers who put information about how many like milligrams of mitragynine or 7-hydroxymitragynine are in or on their products.
Yeah.
But it's certainly not as specific. Like in cannabis, it's all batch specific. So every 15 pounds in Ohio, we have to test for potency.
Yeah.
Whereas like in the unregulated kratom world, the testing that's done, like maybe they measured it 4 times, picked the highest number, and that was 4 years ago, right? And so they're just assuming that it's the same.
Yeah. And it was with one little sample from 2,000 kilos or something.
Yeah, exactly. Their first run before the machines were, worn in and broken down. And so, yeah, I think, safety testing and being informed about what you're consuming is one of the benefits of regulation. It can also lead to increased costs, like you were mentioning, like about $1,000 per strain to get it tested. Get it tested in a cannabis lab. It's a little high, but it's roughly about what that is. If you're talking about heavy metals, pesticides, funguses, molds, all of I think there's 10 or 11 target analyte classes that you're looking at. And it's interesting, at least, these are also things that are tested in corn and soybeans and other stuff that you would just see growing around the state. But in the cannabis market, like, the grows want their stuff tested yesterday for free is what we usually say. Whereas like testing for pesticides, like for corn, will take like 3 weeks and definitely cost $1,000. And so there's just some interesting sort of like commercial capitalistic forces that come into play in these cannabis labs, to where, you also have to be worried about labs artificially increasing the THC, or the potency of products, because increases in THC correlate directly to a higher price point at the retail outlet, at the dispensary. And so THC inflation and lab shopping by the grows, or the processors, like going around giving the same product to 4 different labs and then just selecting the lab that gives them the highest THC number, that would be lab shopping.
So
really? It's certainly, yeah. I mean,
that's hilarious.
It's widespread. Yeah,
and I think I know a company that does it, because I'm not going to call them out or anything. I don't want any trouble. But there's this indica that I have, 20% THC, and this stuff is like really dry. And everybody online, I'm in the Pennsylvania medical marijuana group on Reddit, and everybody's like, yeah, this brand sucks. It looks like when I open it up, it looks like crappy, like old weed. It's like, because I don't smoke that much, so I'll have an eighth for like 3 months, and it looks like the 3rd month. So when I bought it, and it's an indica, but it has like a 20% THC, and I'm like, that it's okay for me because I like mild, but it seems like maybe there might be some lab shopping going on there.
For sure.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at the numbers in Ohio, we have the most number of strains reported over 30% THC of any state in the U.S. And that's primarily due to THC inflation and lab shopping. It's one of the reasons why the state opened up to new applications for opening up additional labs, because at one point there was only 3 labs in the state, with 90% of the testing being done by one lab in particular. And so by opening up to other labs, there's more options and more ways to hold the labs accountable for the numbers they're putting out. So yeah, it was a big deal, I would say, 2019, 2020, where a lot of us in the lab space were trying to work with the state to understand, like, you can only fix your instruments, quote unquote, so many times before you start like getting skeptical of what the results of the lab's putting out repeatedly over and over again.
Do you think there's going to be, like, for Kratom, maybe, like, I don't know if this is even possible, but like a test strip for maybe certain things, like there's fentanyl test strips?
So like that would test for, I mean, so those strips, immunoassays, like commercialized immunoassays, are good for like present, not necessarily for like quantifying the amount. So like 10% THC versus 20% THC is difficult to measure with the test that you could like do on the roadside if you were a law enforcement officer. So for Kratom, I mean, right now you could test the product for like, does this have any fentanyl or opiate analogs in it? And it shouldn't. You could also test to make sure it did have mitragynine present or not present. Maybe the 7-hydroxy, but as this paper sort of laid out, it's naturally occurring concentrations are so low. So I don't know. I mean, it would have to be from a safety perspective. Like, is this Kratom or is this not Kratom? And, they have tests like that for ecstasy, for cocaine, for some of the other festival drugs.
Okay.
And I think there are labs. I know that there's at least 2 labs in Michigan who are testing Kratom products. And at least, the nice thing at least with those labs in Michigan, is that consumers can take the product to the lab and say, hey, can you test this? Whereas right now in Ohio, the only people that can request tests are the growers and the cultivators and the dispensaries. So like in your situation where you got a product that, seemed subpar and not necessarily, matching what you saw in the test results, you could take that to a cannabis lab and get it tested again. In Ohio, you can't do that right now.
It might be because there's only a few labs that even do that for Kratom.
Right. Yeah. So if you were talking about Mitragynine in terms of costing $1,000 per strain to test Kratom, yeah, I mean the standards that are available. So like getting pure Mitragynine or pure 7-hydroxymitragynine, and then calibrating, using those standards to calibrate your instruments so that you can accurately measure it again in a test sample are hundreds, if not thousands of dollars. And it's so it's not widespread. Like even in cannabis, like getting THC or THCV, getting certified reference material or standards for that, there was maybe 2 companies in the US that could do it. There's more now. The market's caught up, but I would certainly think with Kratom, the market demand isn't really there for the testing labs to justify setting up a lab that would just do Kratom.
Did you see this article about study finds cannabis compounds prevent infection by COVID-19 virus? This was in Forbes. And it was
I've seen that.
Was CBGA and CBDA. They're saying they prevent COVID from entering the cells or something like that. Did you see that?
Yeah. So I definitely saw the headlines. It made it across a couple of group texts this morning. Cannabinoids prevent the transmission of SARS to allow it to infect cells. I didn't see it beyond the headline. It's interesting if it is CBG. What you're saying, CBG and
it's
CBDA?
CBDA and CBGA, and at the end of the article, they even say, well, it's not available if you buy CBD, or they're produced by the hemp plant as precursors to CBD and CBG. However, they are different from the acids and are not contained in hemp products. So the acidic forms are found in hemp products. You can get one that has high CBDA. Okay.
There's a term called decarboxylation, and that's the from THCA to delta 9 THC or THCA to delta 10 THC. So that's when you add heat, it decarboxylates. And so you can certainly find products like CBD products that haven't been decarboxylated and have CBDA in them or THCA in them. I guess not from hemp. And CBG is like what they would call the mother cannabinoid or the parent cannabinoid, in that it's CBG is the first cannabinoid synthesized before getting it converted over to CBD or THC. But it's true in that it's difficult to find products that have high concentrations, and by high concentration, we're talking about above 10% of these minor cannabinoids. But ultimately these products are on their way, and you better believe that all of the grows and across the US, across the world, are doing R&D to increase the concentrations of other cannabinoids found in the plant. And that's just one study, one article. So get vaccinated, please. Thank you, Dr. Jonathan Cachat. Check him out on social media at @jcachat. None of the content in this or any episode of Kratom Science Journal Club was intended or should be taken as medical claims or medical advice. Please consult a medical professional. So far, we don't advertise, we don't ask for donations, but we do ask that you share this podcast on your social media, give us a rating, subscribe, comment. The music is Captain Big Wheel. The song is called Moonrunner. Kratom Science Journal Club is produced by me, Brian Gallagher, for KratomScience.com. Take care.